Given that the reliability and validity of a study's operational definition, or lack thereof, influences whether we want to keep working with the article, that's the first thing we're going to look at in the analysis. That said, the first step is to remember the variables in the study and the related operational definitions. That's in Part 5 of the summary worksheet. We can copy and paste from that section of the summary worksheet to make a list in the section A of the analysis worksheet, like I did here. Then we'll start skimming the related sections of the method. In this case, the procedure is after the participants, and we know the participants doesn't include information about the variables, so we'll start with the procedure on page 634. We're looking for information about reliability and validity, and we know that'll be signaled by numbers for the statistical test of reliability, a citation for the source of the operational definition, or information that explains how they made sure the manipulation worked as intended. The first paragraph of the procedure explains what the participants did and what the researchers did, so it really doesn't have anything we're looking for. The second paragraph explains the manipulation, and the information about the physiotherapy tape and LED markers seems like it relates to the effectiveness of the manipulation, but they don't say anything about whether it was effective, so we'll keep skimming. The third paragraph is back to what the participants did. So far, there isn't anything definitely about reliability and validity. It seems like the paragraph with the reading task heading should have really had a heading about establishing a baseline for the physiological measure. As far as I can tell, that was the primary purpose. Given that, it does help us know that they did make sure the physiological measure was valid, so I'll include the highlighted information in my analysis notes. This is how I made a note of that information in my worksheet. The next section of the procedure is about the stress task. Now that we know the name after the name of the measure is a citation, and that means there's a study about the validity of the process, we know that's important. In this case, they also underscore that point with the phrase, a well-validated protocol. But since we know the secret code, we can just make note of the citation. The rest of the section describes what participants did as a part of the process of inducing stress. So it's helpful for understanding what participants actually did, but not information we'd include in the notes for the analysis. I'm breaking up the sections to make them easier to work with in the slides, so it'd probably be good for me to mention that this is part of across 2 pages, page 634 and 635 to be specific. The list of variables I copied from the summary worksheet didn't include the citation for the social stress test, so I added that to the information about operational definitions. The measures section starts after the section about the stress task on page 635 of the article, and that's the next section where we'll find signals that the researchers considered the reliability and validity of the measures. Now that we know to look for citations as a signal of validity, those might start jumping out at you. We need to make sure to think about the content of the sentences to know for sure, though, that the citation relates to validity. For example, since that's at the end of the sentence with the name of the measure, we know that's a primary source, and that's the one that would have the information about validity. The citation at the end of the next sentence is probably to support the information about the measure mapping to the affect circumplex. There isn't actually a separate source for information about how participants responded to the questions. The information about mapping to the circumplex could relate to content validity or to criterion validity, or both. We'd need to look at the cited article to know for sure. We won't go into that level of detail, but make sure to include the citation in the information we have about the measure. If we continue to skim the information about the AVI, the phrase test, retest, reliability jumps out. That sentence pretty much just lists the ways the reliability and validity of the measure have been tested, and then provides the citations for the articles that explain those tests. Last sentence is about the reliability in this particular study. Sometimes the measure will be reliable for other samples and not for a particular study, which is really a bummer for the researcher, since that tends to mean they put a lot of time into something that might not have results that are publishable. But I digress. You might have already noticed this sentence includes the specific Cronbach's alphas for the measure. Those numbers are a little lower than the guidelines we saw in the research methods books, but not so much so to be alarming. This is what I included in my notes about that. You might notice I didn't include the specific Cronbach's alphas. That's because the reviewers and editors considered them strong enough to publish the articles, and we would look at the other sources if we were thinking about using this for a study we were conducting. So indicating that it was considered reliable is sufficient. I know that probably sounds like I'm contradicting myself, since one of the overall ideas of this module is that we need to be skeptical about all articles. But here's my logic. The articles referenced in this article are from two journals that I'm familiar with, Emotion and the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. So that lets me know I can trust the process. Even if I didn't know about the specific journals, knowing that they're from two different journals is a good sign. The next part of the affect portion of the measures section describes the linguistic inquiry and word count measure. This is pretty similar to the two measures we've reviewed so far, so I'm not going to walk through each part, though I do have the related sections highlighted, so you can cross-reference the model of analysis worksheet to see where the information came from if you need to. The sections about the other measured variables do include a few things I want to point out. First, for the perceived threat measure, the information about the source is a little later in the explanation. Unfortunately, the organization of an article isn't always as consistent as it could be, so it's helpful to remember what information we're looking for and keep skimming, especially if it seems like the author is omitting something. The other thing I want to emphasize in the perceived threat section is the sentence that starts with Rappy 1997. That information relates to content validity or to criterion validity of the measure. This is similar to the information I found about the affect valuation index when I said we'd need to check the primary source to see for sure how it was tested. The word showed suggests they might have compared the measure to other measures of those concepts, which would be criterion validity. But that's not as important for our purpose as knowing that the measure has been validated. The section about the self-esteem measure does include the citation at the end of the first sentence. It also includes a couple of phrases that signal it was reliable and valid for this study. One of those phrases is the one about being sensitive to laboratory manipulations. That means it's a valid measure of changes in self-esteem over a relatively short time, like the study. That goes along with the information later in the paragraph that mentions temporary changes, too. The sentence that begins, "Research suggests," has the phrase, "is psychometrically sound." That's a fancy way of saying that the forms of reliability have been tested. Task persistence and cardiovascular response are quite a bit different than what we've looked at so far. One thing that might jump out at you right away is that the explanation of task persistence is pretty short compared to the others. It's only one sentence. It also doesn't include any of the signals about reliability and validity that we saw for the other measures. I'll explain more about what that means in another recording. For now, I just want to point it out in case it seems like you're missing something. The measure of cardiovascular response is different because it's a physiological measure and all of the others we looked at so far have been self-report. In this case, the authors include a sentence that's similar to what we've seen for self-report measures, though. I highlighted it in this slide. Okay, so this is what I have so far. But what about the posture manipulation? Did they really change how participants were sitting? Did they do something besides look at participants to see if the ones in the upright group were sitting differently than the slumped group? How did they know the participants in the upright group were actually upright the whole time and the ones in the slumped group stayed slumped? The procedure information included information about LED markers that I said might be related to the consistency of the manipulation. But that section didn't include information about the actual consistency, so we need to keep looking. You might remember we're looking for information about what's technically called a manipulation check. Sometimes the authors directly refer to it that way, which is handy. In other cases, we have to think about what we're looking for and how the authors might write about it. This article is similar to how many authors approach it. The methods section included information about how the effectiveness was manipulated, but didn't directly say why that information was relevant. Then, one of the first parts of the results, on page 636 in this case, talks about the manipulation. One way to find this type of information in other articles is to skim the results looking for a section or a paragraph that just talks about the manipulated variable, like this one does. This article does include a table with the phrase manipulation check in the title, but that's a lot of information to digest. So I focused on the related part of the article narrative, the section labeled postural manipulation. We don't really need to think about all the details in this paragraph, but there are three parts that are helpful to understand and to know the answers to the questions I asked in the last slide, the three that I highlighted in this slide. No significant differences at baseline means that all participants had a similar posture before the manipulation. Significant main effects for groups means that the upright group did have a different posture than the slumped group. So that indicates they did change how participants were sitting, and the ones in the slumped group were sitting differently than the ones in the upright group. The last sentence tells us that the differences between groups increased during the stress task. This is how I captured that information in my analysis. I did go back to the procedure to get the details about the LED markers and how they figured out the angles, because without that information, it'd be really confusing to know how they knew that there wasn't a difference at baseline and there was a difference later. Now that we've found all of the information, we're ready to answer the big question. Do we think this study is scientifically credible so far? The first thing we can ask is whether there were acceptable levels of reliability for each of the measured variables. We found evidence about that for all but one of the variables, task persistence, and the details were sufficient, so we can be comfortable with that part of the study overall. Then we can ask about the validity. In some cases, looking at this information will help you realize that the study was really about something other than you thought what it was about, so you might set it aside for that reason alone. If the operational definitions were a good fit with what you're thinking about, then you need to consider whether the authors provided sufficient evidence of the validity of the measured variables. Once again, the article included related information about all of the variables except task persistence. The information included about the other variables doesn't create any questions about credibility, though. But what about task persistence? From one perspective, we could say, what is there to question? Because it was a pretty straightforward measure. Total word count during the reading task and the stress task, with the reading task as used baseline to control for differences in reading speed. Without more information about whether this has been used before, though, I'm not entirely confident they were measuring task persistence. So I'd probably not include the related findings when I thought about how this added to my understanding, and I highlighted my notes about the measure to remind me of that. If the study was non-experimental, we would stop there and consider this study scientifically credible with one quirk. Scientifically, we would probably say one exception. Since this is an experiment, we do need to question the manipulation. The first step in that process is noting that there was a manipulation check. If there wasn't, we'd probably want to discard the study. In this case, though, there was a manipulation check, and it indicated the manipulation was effective. So we might put an asterisk next to the questions about measured variables, given what I mentioned about the task persistence measure, but we can definitely check off the question of whether the manipulation was effective. And overall, we can say, yes, this is a scientifically credible study.